Welcome to StellarStrategyGaming. This is Mara and Ben, and today we're going to be talking about tieflings. Tieflings are humans who have some distant ancestor who was a demon. So, like that one random redhead in your family, they get ostracized for something that was not their fault. Tieflings get a whole suite of abilities in the book. They're resistant to fire damage. They have additional magical abilities. They get a bump to their charisma, which is probably the least understood mechanic in the game. Basically, people think charisma is if you look at someone and you want to have sex with them, they have high charisma. That's not quite how it works. It can be. Charisma is a power from within. An example in the real world would be somebody like Peter Dinklage, who is not conventionally an attractive man, but he has a real presence to him that makes people drawn to him, makes people want to pay attention to him. And in the D&D world, where something like a cleric's faith can manifest itself in magical power, or a wizard's intelligence can manifest itself in magical power, that drive and power from within can manifest, again, as a magical force that affects reality.
Yes, now, there are actually several classes which use charisma, so tieflings are a pretty good choice if you want to have a lot of diversity with your class. They can be used for a bard, a sorcerer, a warlock, or even a paladin. And I'm not even getting into variants there, which I'm sure would enhance each of those in some way. And there are too many variants to count, for the record. But yeah, so they definitely have some versatility to them in how widespread they can be across all the different classes, and because of the fact that they're not too strong in any one field other than charisma, it also means that they can do things like take a lot of different feats without having to specialize too much. It's a point where Ben and I have disagreed in the past is that I think that they are the perfect bard. So,
yes, and there are variants in what kind of tiefling you can make. Now, the player's handbook gives the tieflings what's called the Infernal Legacy. You know, the Thaumaturgy cantrip, when you reach 3rd level, you can cast Hellish Rebuke as a 2nd level spell. When you reach 5th level, you can cast the Darkness spell. Charisma is your spellcasting modifier for these. I'm not going to go into all the variants in detail. They're listed in Mornicane's Tome of Foes, and there's also more variant abilities in the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. But there are several of them, and they are definitely worth looking into. There are variants that are perfect for something like a rogue or a trickery domain cleric build. There are variants that are perfect for a paladin that give some additional paladin smite abilities. You can just really go crazy. Your imagination's the limit on this stuff.
yes, see, there is a problem here, though. And it's a problem that everyone probably knew was coming because it's been brought up more than once before, but it is the fact that being a tiefling in the current version of the lore is completely random. Among all races, or at least it's never specifically said that a race can't have a tiefling child. I would assume that an Aasimar could not give birth to a tiefling just because they would be literally the exact opposites of the planar alignment. But even so, the fact that there's nothing that clearly states this is a problem because, first off, it means that there is no tiefling people. There's no culture behind them if it's completely random where they show up in the world. For example, if Ben here suddenly had another kid, and it was a person from Australia, it would be one of those like, well, they're not going to have an Australian culture because they appeared in America, you know. So it's that sort of problem. And on top of that, also, it's just kind of lackluster. I feel like that there are some great ways you could incorporate becoming a tiefling into a campaign, because the way how it's written in the book is that the ancestor who did this signed some sort of contract, and one of the prices was that a certain number of his descendants would be promised to one of the 9 lords or something like that. And so why not have it be that your warlock's backstory for the Fiend is that he signed a deal with one of the 9 Hells lords or something like that. It works with changelings too. You can totally do that for the warlock, though. Focusing more on tieflings, again, still perfectly valid.
So to be clear, there are a couple of different versions of how one becomes a tiefling or how one gets born as a tiefling. One of them is that your ancestors entered into a dark pact with some fiendish entity, and it sort of the bloodline was tainted. A little bit as with what happened to the Fey giants who became the Fomorians. So there's always the possibility of this bloodline procreating tieflings. Another variation of it is that it works more like a highly recessive gene, where one of your ancestors got very familiar with a fiend, and the result is that in your bloodline there is the genetics that can produce a tiefling. And Mara is absolutely right. You have this problem that because there's no distinct tiefling culture, you don't have the rich sort of lore and backstory and cultural norms that come something like a halfling or a gnome or an elf or even a half-orc.
Yes, and sort of to continue on that, also, this actually is partially the fault of Wizards of the Coast here, but the thing is that Ben just mentioned a whole lot of genetic traits, and it sounds very much like, for example, the French kings, how after a certain point they were so inbred that they had a chance to just manifest a few random traits, even if they actually had fairly good genetics themselves. The Habsburg chin is always the infamous one, and so reducing an entire species to a genetic defect also just makes it hard to take them seriously on some level.
Now, my very first character was a tiefling. He was a tiefling cleric, and what I decided to do, when I discussed this with the DM before the game started, was that this character's actual alignment was neutral, but he served a goodly god because he was trying to bring healing magic to the tieflings, and he was also attempting to improve the reputation of the tieflings. This meant that the DM had to set up a world where tieflings were more common than they are in the lore, and it worked out pretty well. And the way it worked out was a way that I did not expect, which was that no other tiefling besides my character cared at all about this character's noble quest to raise the reputation of their people. Everybody else was just trying to survive and make some coin. I think the DM partly did this as a way of subtly discouraging me from going too far from this, because if you get into too far into that kind of tangential RP, especially if the whole party isn't tieflings, which we weren't, then you are distracting the players from the very important parts of D&D, which is the serious business of murdering, sexing, and stealing everything you come into contact with. But one thing that my character did do is that whenever we were in a combat situation against another tiefling, he would try to sort of address them as, like, look, we're both of a kind, let's try to work this out, let's try to work together. And one of the main villains was another tiefling who wasn't there for it, so it became like this personal vendetta my character had against a big bad that he otherwise would have had absolutely no interest in. You can make it work in the RP perspective, just don't go overboard with the emo persecuted outcast as a player, and as a DM, don't go overboard with every NPC you meet hates your character, because it just gets dull after a while. I'm going to be wrapping it up with this one. We're trying to make our videos a little more succinct, letting brevity be the soul of wit, as it were. As always, we thank you for watching.
Yes, my final thought on the matter is also just one last thing for DMs, which is, while you shouldn't have every NPC hate your character, be sure to have at least a few characters notice yours, because it's a bit like negating a racial or class ability. It just, while it can still be a fun game, it does fundamentally take something out of it, especially as tieflings are so built around it. But yes, wrapping it up, we hope you liked this video, and if so, please leave a like and a comment. If you want to, please even subscribe and click that bell icon to get future updates. Next time, we'll be talking about how to run a campaign in the Abyss.